historians. Welcome to the podcast section of your Unit 1.1 American Democracy Notes. This podcast is going to continue to give you more supplemental or additional information that'll help you understand the web search you just completed. This podcast, therefore, is tackling the same objective, which is students will be able to recall what a democracy is, explain what the U.S. Constitution is, and describe 3 facts about Americans' government by writing a 5-sentence free-write paragraph. Let's get started. We already know that the American government is a democracy, meaning a government where the regular people like you and I have the power, and the government, which is the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch, is supposed to do what the majority of the people want and ask. Now, usually, the regular people like you and I will either vote or call or visit or write letters or sometimes even protest and petition in order to let the government know what we want. And once we've let these different branches of our government know what we want, they are supposed to follow what it is we're asking for. Why are they supposed to do what it is we're asking for? Because it's the law in the Constitution. The Constitution is this extremely old document, which is basically like a syllabus for our nation. This document basically states what the American government, meaning the 3 branches, is allowed to do and is not allowed to do. And one of the key things written into this Constitution is that the American government would follow and carry out the wishes of the majority of the people. Now, some of you and some other Americans will argue that the American government is not upholding the Constitution because the American government often ignores or goes against the wishes of the majority of its people. We'll table that for a different conversation. If we take a look here in the upper right-hand corner, we can see an image of the Founding Fathers, meaning the Americans who sat down and basically decided to make America a democracy, and also who wrote this Constitution that gave the power to the people. Some of these Founding Fathers may sound or be familiar to you. For example, Founding Fathers included George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and many more. These Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution at this building right here that I got a chance to visit. This building is known as the Philadelphia Convention, and after many days of discussing and debating and arguing, the Founding Fathers finally agreed upon the final Constitution verbiage, meaning the words, and signed this document effectively into law on September 17, 1787. Not only did I get a chance to go outside and check out the Philadelphia Convention, I also got a chance to go inside the actual room where these Founding Fathers debated what exactly the Constitution would say. One of the main things the Constitution talked about was this idea called separation of powers. The Founding Fathers knew that the American government needed to have 3 powers. The first was to be able to make the laws. The second was to review the laws, meaning to be able to change them or get rid of them. And finally, the American government also needed to be able to enforce the laws. However, the Founding Fathers were afraid. They worried that if they gave all 3 of these powers to one person or to one group, that one person or group would become a tyrant. Another word for tyrant is a dictator, which we already know means a bad ruler. Now, if you can imagine, if you're the only person that has all the power, or you are part of a small group that has all the power, it's very easy for you or for your small group to pretty much do whatever you want since you guys have all the power. It pretty much is a bad idea to give one person or give one group of people so many powers that they can use to be dictators. And so the Founding Fathers decided to create this thing called separation of powers, which means that they would take the American government we see here, and they would divide the American government into the 3 different branches you learned about in your web search, okay? By dividing the government into three branches, the Founding Fathers realized that they could prevent dictators, because the legislative branch would be the branch that got the powers to write the law, and that's all they could do. The executive branch would be the branch that would get the powers to enforce the law, and that's all they could do. And the judicial branch would get the power to review the laws, and that's all they could do. Because of the separation of powers idea written into the Constitution, this is why in America today we have three different branches of government who each have to collaborate and negotiate and work together in order to run the country. Another idea that was written into the Constitution is this thing called checks and balances. To make sure that none of the branches would become tyrants or dictators, the separation of powers creates a checks and balance system that is written into the Constitution. Checks and balance system means that each branch has the ability to limit or stop the other branch's power. Let's take a look at our graph. In this graph, we can see the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. When President Trump decides to enforce a law, if he's enforcing a law that's unfair, the judicial branch, meaning the court branch of our nation, can basically check him and say, President Trump, that law is unfair, that law is illegal, therefore we're going to cancel out that law. And even though President Trump is the President of the United States, literally the judicial court system can stop him from enforcing an illegal or unfair law. Now, President Trump, let's say that he wants to create a law. Guess what? He doesn't have the power to create the law. Only the legislative branch has the power to write laws. So if President Trump wants a law created, and let's say this is a law that says people have to now go to high school for 6 years, he cannot legally do that. He will have to go to the legislative branch and see if the legislative branch will work with him and will agree to write this law. Therefore, the legislative branch can check or limit President Trump's power. Now, not only can the legislative and judicial branch limit the president's power, but the president can also limit the legislative and judicial's power, and the legislative can limit the judicial and the executive power. It's literally this triangle of limitations where each of these branches has one power and can also limit the power of the others. What does this mean? This means, like I mentioned earlier, that all three of our branches basically have to cooperate and work together in order to run the country the way that the majority of the people want the nation ran. One branch by itself is not able to run the country. It is not able to run the country by itself because our founding fathers created a constitution that talked about separation of powers, which created a checks and balance system, which reduces the likelihood of our government becoming a dictator. What I'd like you to do next is I'd like you to go ahead and watch this video called Who's Got the Power? If you pause the podcast, you'll be able to find the link for this video. Now, this video is kind of a funny rap video that pretty much talks about how the three different branches of government have to work together in order to run the nation, and how the three different branches of government also limit each other's power. In order to ensure that you get to the correct video for this assignment, you want to make sure that the video page looks like this, and the title should be 3 Branches Rap Smart Songs. While you watch this video, please be sure to complete the directions on the assigned section of your notes. The directions say, as you watch the clip, jot down 3 takeaways, meaning any 3 things you learned in the section provided. Go ahead and locate this video link now in Google Classroom, and when you're done with this link, come back to your podcast. Now that you're done watching the funny rap video, hopefully you got a better idea of how the checks and balance system works. Utilize this graph here to really understand the checks and balance system. If we take a look, we can see here that the president carries out the law, meaning that he or she has the ability to enforce the laws. If the president feels that the legislative branch is becoming too much like a dictator, these are all the checks that the president can stop and place on the legislative branch. At the same time, the legislative branch, if it feels the president is becoming a dictator, these are all the checks or all the limits the legislative branch can put on the president. If we take a look at the bottom of our graphic organizer, we can see the types of checks that the legislative branch can put on the judicial branch and the types of checks that the judicial branch can put on the legislative. We can also see how the legislative branch can limit the president's power and how the president can limit the judicial branch's power as well. I highly recommend pausing your podcast and thoroughly reading the yellow highlighted checks and balances that each of the branches can place. These checks and balances will be really important not only for your content formative assessment, but will also be very important for your summative assessment college level writing essay. If you need assistance with understanding the graphic organizer, feel free to either do some online research of your own or come into office hours so we can talk about these different examples of how the three branches can limit each other's power. This is the end of our podcast. Go ahead and stop the video, and if you're completing this in class, raise your hand to let the teacher know. If you're completing your podcast at home, please be sure to let the teacher know during the next class session that your podcast notes are completed.